And going live now. We're live. Alrighty, so welcome everybody to another episode of the Headphone Show. And this time we have, of course, Tyler and myself, but then we also have special guests Crinacle and Tom from Dunu. So big thanks to you guys for joining us on this. I guess it's Saturday morning for us and very late at night for you guys. But this is going to be a bit more of a IEM focused discussion, even though we'll probably get into some of the over-ear stuff because Crin's now gotten into that as well. But if you guys are watching this in the future, I will have a podcast version of this as well, linked in the description. And then just for anybody who's unaware, Crin runs the website In Ear Fidelity, so I'll leave a link to that as well in the description for this if you guys want to check that stuff out. But we might as well get going here. I have a number of questions, a number of topics that I'd love to ask you guys. And I want to start with asking a number of questions of Tom. I actually recently did Tom knows this, but I've recently gone over a number of Dunu IEMs, including the Luna and the DK3001 hybrid, and the other hybrids as well. There's the DK2001 as well. And I wanted to get Tom's take on a number of just sort of product development questions. So I figured I might as well start us off there. First, when it came to the Dunu Luna, I mean, actually, I tried it. The first time I tried that was actually at CanJam. And I think it was either you or somebody there was telling me that it took a long time for you guys to develop this. And I was wondering, like, what were sort of the design goals with the Luna?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I think, yeah, it was me who was there,
Yeah.
and that was actually my first CanJam, actually, in North America at least, because I've been basically living in Asia for the last 10 or so odd years. So that was actually my first time actually doing a CanJam in the US. So that was fun. And so, but going back to your question, yeah, it took us actually, I think about I want to say 3 or 3.5 years, basically from planning to basically signing all of the contracts, getting the production up and running, going through prototypes. I think it was 2017 when we first started talking to the beryllium suppliers, and then I want to say 2018, first half of 2018, when we first got the first shipment of beryllium foil, and we started playing with it. So yeah, it was definitely over 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Basically the first maybe like 6 months before that was spent on just thinking about what we wanted to do with this type of material. And it really stemmed from, I think, a core design goal. And it started off with, I think, what we had before. We started off with a product, I think, in 2016, that was the original DK3001.
Not the Pro.
And yeah, not the Pro.
Gotcha.
And at that time, we actually had in development the DK4001 as well,
Mm-hmm.
as well as a number of other products. And the core idea was that we wanted to use a larger diameter dynamic driver for the low end.
Mm-hmm.
And what we discovered was that in order to get the kind of dynamic range reproduction that we needed out of a large driver, we needed to make a pretty large skirt or surround. And so we thought, why don't we try and build on that idea, try to go for new ways to try and optimize dynamic range reproduction. And so I think it was at that time where we found out that Materion was actually looking for companies to try and develop a beryllium driver earphone using their material. And so I think they just started from there.
when it comes to using beryllium, I mean, there's now a few of them out there. I'm aware of actually 3 beryllium driver IMs, and maybe there's more of this. But what I'm wondering is, the let's say adventures into beryllium for dynamic driver IEM development. Do you see this as kind of like a way forward to as opposed to the sort of hybrid styles that you find with many other IEMs like the DK3001 Pro as well? It seems like there's 2 different ways of achieving good technicalities across the board, and then this really nice dynamic driver in the base. Do you see like beryllium as like a way forward for this as an alternative to the hybrid designs, or is this something that can go in conjunction with them? Is one better than the other? What's sort of your take on that?
Okay. So I think there are 2 different ideas at play that I think you're referring to. The first being that hybrid drivers are a way of getting a lot of detail out of the mids and highs while sort of preserving that nice and thumpy low end. And the other idea is, what if we just use a traditional dynamic driver to reproduce everything, right? I'm assuming that's what you're trying to get at here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, let me just start off by saying very simply that we will be continuing hybrid design development, except also with sort of the lessons that we've learned from the development of the Luna. So we definitely don't see it as 2, like
Competing.
basically, they're not. Basically, a dynamic driver is a dynamic driver. We can try to make it do whatever it is that we'd like it to do, right? So if we want it to just be a woofer, then we could try and do it that way.
Right.
And so basically, we see a dynamic driver or a balanced armature driver, any type of driver, right? Planar, electric, what have you. Any of these drivers are just tools, and whatever it is that we're using, we'd like for it to sort of have its own character and have it be brought out as much as possible, right? So the reason why we chose beryllium, right, was because of all the properties that I think a lot of people have maybe looked into, right? Beryllium has a very high stiffness to weight ratio. It also doesn't ring very much. So it's really an ideal driver for sonic applications, right? But it doesn't really mean that it's the end all be all, right? I know there are a lot of people who sort of dream about having a diamond driver, and that's why I think something like diamond-like carbon has been thrown around. But all of these things are really only just variations. There's substrates for what we want to do, right? We want a driver that is very stiff and a surround that is very compliant, and we want it to distort as little as possible. And the rest is about how we play around with the vibrational modes of the driver to get that response that we want.
Right.
Yeah. So for us, it's not necessarily about, beryllium is the only way to go, but it's really just one of many things that we use.
Right. When you did start this project with the Luna, did you find, just working with beryllium and these materials, did you find any unique challenges that you weren't expecting, kind of going into it? Whether for tuning or anything else.
So let me preface by saying that, obviously I'm not I'm not the acoustic engineer who designed everything, so I'm not actually familiar with every single challenge that went on. But for us, I think something that is overlooked, we spent a lot of time just now talking about beryllium, right? But I think what we spent more time on was figuring out how to design the actual driver to make, to actually make Beryllium work.
Right.
So the important thing that I think, uh, we should that I should probably explain is that in order to get a true beryllium foil driver to be mounted into a dynamic driver, we have to sort of glue the foil itself edge to edge to its surround. And that is a design that is what is termed a composite driver.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same. It's a very similar type of design to what Focal has done with
Right.
their Utopian Stellia,
I think
but
ZMFs are
also
like that as
the.
well.
I'm not familiar with how those drivers are
Mm.
made, but I do know for sure that the entire sort of Focal line,
Right.
including the Clear and the LER, they are designed in this composite fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so what we've done is take that sort of composite driver design, which has been done in the past. But what we've done is try to, use two different materials of very sort of different compliances and put them together
Mm-hmm.
and actually put them into a really small in-ear product. And so that was the big challenge, rather than
Right.
the beryllium foil itself, right? That thing, um, it's that is actually Materion doing that stuff for us, right?
Right. I got you.
We,
Yeah.
yeah, so we send them a mold design, right? They actually make the molds for us. They stamp out all of the beryllium for us, and then they send it to us pre-formed. So we don't really have to worry about all this safety issues surrounding beryllium.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so all of that stuff is their side of development, while our side really has to do with how do we get that beryllium and how do we glue it, into the surround, and
Right.
and in fact, how do we choose the material for the surround? Um, so I usually I don't like commenting on other companies' products, but I think because of this type of driver, a lot of people have been asking. There are pretty much right now only two beryllium foil driver IEMs talked about right now, right?
Yeah.
So I think you've reviewed both of them. So it'd be the Luna and also the A8000 by Final Audio, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they use a different material surround than we do,
Oh, interesting.
right? Yeah, and so they use um, I don't remember exactly. I'm not sure. But they use a different material surround, right? So they have a different design goal than we do, and so choosing this material for the surround is, and also choosing and sort of developing formulations for the adhesive that needs to go between the surround and the diaphragm itself is actually even more important than the fact that the Luna is a beryllium foil driver IM.
This sounds like something that Antdroid would know about. He's I think he's an adhesives materials engineer. But that's interesting to hear about. The differences in implementation. But I mean, what you're saying essentially then is that what you guys are focused on is the implementation of this material, not as much the material itself.
Yeah. I
And
mean, we trust in the fact that whatever Materion gives us
mhm.
is the kind of material that really does work for acoustics, right? So, I think the thing that we must remember is that Materion as a company has actually sort of been in the audio game for a while.
Mhm.
They've been supplying speaker diaphragms to a lot of high-end speaker companies for a very long time. And in fact, I would say that even Focal gets the raw material from Materion themselves,
Mhm.
because Materion basically owns 90% of the entire beryllium market.
Mhm.
And there are many reasons for that. So the main reason is that they're a highly vertically integrated company. And so they own their own beryllium mine in Utah, and they process all of that beryllium ore and then send it to various different facilities in the US. And they actually have a very large reserve of beryllium right there in Utah. The
Hmm.
other sort of sources of beryllium around the world are basically in places that are a little questionable politically. And so basically, if you're buying from those sources, maybe you might not know the next price of your shipment of beryllium, and you might, and one day that mine might dry up. So I think most people tend to buy from Materion as a result.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. I didn't know that about that they were actually mined in the U.S. and for some of them.
Hmm.
That's interesting to know. Um, uh, you mentioned earlier about the implementation and the shell design and the housing and all that stuff. I wanted to ask about the fit, because something like a theme that I've noticed with a lot of Dunu IEMs, well, at least the recent ones that I've been sort of evaluating, is that the fit is very, very comfortable. Like they're very on the Luna specifically, it's more of like a shallow fit that I often, even when I talk to people about IEMs, they go, I don't like, putting stuff into my ears. Whereas with the Luna, it's more of like it doesn't really feel quite like a, typical IEM, where you're inserting it into your ear canal. When you're developing something like the Luna, um, how how much are you guys thinking about fit versus optimal sonic performance given ear or the insertion depth and stuff like that?
I think I think our concern with fit started from our older products. So a
Hmm.
lot of this stuff has sort of predates me because I really only joined the company uh, late last year,
Okay.
just as the Luna was about to announce. So, but essentially, I think a lot of people had comfort issues with Dunu's previous products. So basically, the previous
Like the
DN
Titan.
2000,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
2000, yeah, the DN 2000 hybrid line, as well as the DK 3001, the original.
Right.
Um, and so while the DK 3001, the original, was very small in size, it had, a bunch of oddly placed corners, and the insertion angle for the stem was kind of, it was a little steep. So there were quite a number of people who had fit issues.
Hmm.
So for example, like I didn't have fit issues, but a ton of other people had a ton of issues with it. And so I think from there, the company recognized that there was a lot of room for improvement, and so we went back to the drawing board, looked at, all the different things that we could try to do to try and improve comfort. Um, with respect to sort of packaging and size, um, I don't think it has been an issue because we've sort of been able to optimize what we do in terms of CNC uh, programming and things like that to be able to fit whatever size driver that we need into that small of a package.
Right.
Um, I think where we do run into limitations is in the sort of hybrid packaging. In order to fit all of those drivers into such a small size, um, so right now the highest sort of driver count that we can do is four balance armatures and a dynamic driver down low.
Hmm.
Um, and that's pretty much packing everything in. Um, and while we could probably put in one more or even two more, I think we have to consider whether, we really need to do that, and whether um, the sort of the path lengths for sound reproduction are actually optimized in that case,
Right.
right? Yeah. So I think that's where we run into a technical issue. Like if we stick in more drivers, uh, will it actually enhance sound?
Mm.
Or is it just sticking in more drivers for the sake of doing so?
Right. It's interesting because so Crin and I really like the Moondrop Blessing too, but there's a
Hmm.
lot of people, where if for that IEM, the it's just very large, like the nozzle size and like the whole IEM is just a little bit large, and I don't know if Crin's been doing this, but I've certainly been recommending, to a lot of people, if they want to get a good, very agreeable tuning, and they like the idea of something like that, with sort of a hybrid driver IEM. If the fit on the Blessing 2 is a challenge, the DK3001 Pro is sort of it's like near the top now of my recommendation, and like, it's funny because it surprised me how much I value that, because I don't think normally about that kind of stuff when I'm evaluating and reviewing IEMs, because I'm not using them as just regular devices. I'm more approaching it from like an analytic and critical evaluation standpoint. But when it comes to actually using the IEM for longer periods of time, it's amazing how much of a difference that makes. I find, at least. I don't know. That was just something that I was thinking about. And so, both what you're saying is that if you had a larger size to work with, you'd be able to put more drivers in. But in theory, there's a sort of a question mark there still for what the benefit of doing that would be. And so, as it stands right now, you're kind of optimizing what you can do, and finding the best sort of cadence for comfort to performance. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, sure. I think what I can add to that statement would be that uh, we always try to design to have our housings to be as small as possible so that we can fit the largest number of ears,
Mm.
right? Um, we have sort of run into an issue with, especially with the Luna, that the housings are almost too small, and that a lot of people have started telling us that it doesn't feel secure enough in the ears.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that issue might be because the stems on the Luna are a little shorter than normal.
Right.
Um, but if you look at the stems on the Luna compared to, a bunch of other in-ears, right? They're actually, kind of average size and length. Um, so I think it's the fact that it is so small that people are saying that it's just not secure enough. I
Mm-hmm.
remember using, this is way back in the day. If you guys know the QJs from J's, like a Swedish brand,
Mm.
yeah, they were tiny, tiny earphones. And I remember when I was really, back in the day when I was young and in this hobby, I really liked the way they were so small, but then at the same time, they were kind of just floaty
Mm-hmm.
and didn't feel very substantial in my ears. And so I think that type of feeling, while it's very, it's almost weightless, it doesn't have a sense of security. So
Right.
I think there are positives and negatives to having small, comfortable shells. Um, and at the same time, what we're working on right now, we actually just launched a product line that is based around the sort of same acrylic shell design as the Blessing 2.
Okay.
Um, and so what we're trying to do now is to try to find, a shell sort of design that is a good happy medium, having that kind of security inside your ear, but also still fitting a lot of different ear shapes. Um, but I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge for not just us, but just pretty much any company that makes in-ears.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we like everyone needs to try to slowly adjust the shape of their earphones to try and fit at least what their target demographic is.
Right.
And eventually, I think what we'll see is that there will be different shaped shells for different types of populations. And actually, a company has actually done that. Uh, In-ear monitoring, a German sort of pro audio company actually did that. I think with their SD line of earphones. So this is something that I think companies will eventually start doing more commonly,
Mm.
and especially for the very mainstream companies out there.
So rather than developing, one design for the shell and everything, it's development for a number of different types of fit, something like that.
Yeah, or at least that something will they'll design something modular enough to
Mm.
be able to fit different size shells or fins or other sort of attachments onto their earphones. Um,
Right.
but I think it's definitely a challenge for every single company out there.
Mm-hmm. Um, for the hybrids, so something like the DK3001 Pro, what are the balanced armature drivers that are in there right now? And if you had a different shell design, would that expand the capabilities of the type of balanced armature drivers that you'd be able to put in them?
Uh, well, I well, so basically, we have classically only used balanced armature drivers from Knowles
Mm-hmm.
Acoustics,
Right.
and the main reason for that is that Knowles is the one of the oldest producers of balanced armature drivers, and and they are known for their great quality control. And
Mm.
so we usually what happens is that everyone when they order balanced armature drivers, they get it in trays, bunch of little trays of filled with little tiny little
Yeah.
BA drivers. And and what happens is that other companies that do build balanced armature drivers, their defect rate is higher than
Mm.
basically than Knowles. And so we mainly use have in the past used Knowles balanced armature drivers because of their great quality control. And it is not to say that BA drivers from other companies are not good, because um, there are BA drivers from other companies that are definitely pretty darn good. And in fact, Sony makes their own BA drivers, and there are a bunch of companies now in China that make balanced armature drivers, and for a much lower cost than Knowles makes them.
Right.
Uh, yeah. So it it's really not about what type of driver, um, or what company they're from, but really more about how how these drivers are selected.
Mm-hmm.
And if you talk to basically any custom in-ear company's chief acoustic designer, they will often talk about sort of the core sound that a type of balanced armature driver, will make.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, the very famous Knowles TWFK, right? That they a lot of people tend to say that it has a type of sound, or the ED driver, which has been used in for decades in the Etymotic ER4. It
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of designers will say that has a type of sound, and some people will say like a competing company, um, like for example the Sony on 2300 series, they have a slightly different type of sound than the Knowles ED driver,
Crin loves
right?
those.
Um, so uh, what I think what designers mean in terms of the type of sound is um, I think a product of a lot of different things, right? First, there's frequency response, there's distortion profile, um, but also how they react, and electrically,
Mm-hmm.
um, because different companies make different types of like make their BA drivers from slightly different materials, and that might just end up uh, allowing their drivers to react very slightly differently, under different sort of voltage loads, um, and so uh, I don't know exactly what the differences are, because I don't think any designer really knows.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of half the fun of it. I think a lot of these designers just like to pick and choose between different drivers and see, okay, the do I like this sound, and do I want to use it um in my design? And actually, like, I wanna talk about Andy Zhao, who is our acoustic designer, and he's actually responsible for voicing all of our products. And he actually does this with dynamic drivers as well. So right now he's designing a earphone that we're calling Zen. Um, and he's actually choosing from slightly different um, driver diaphragm materials. And he's and I asked him a few weeks ago, like, okay, so how do you want to tune this earphone? Like, what type of sound signature would you like? And he said, I don't know. And the reason why he says I don't know is that he says he needs to hear the particular characteristics of that driver first,
Interesting.
in order to decide how exactly he wants to optimize for that driver.
Hmm.
Um, Now, obviously, what we can do is that we can sort of shoehorn any driver into having the frequency response that we want, but would that necessarily mean that it's the sort of, so to speak, best version of itself?
Right.
That I think is a big question mark.
Interesting. So a lot of the way that IEMs are tuned is based on not necessarily on whether or not something hits a target curve, but more so the driver itself and what's best for the driver. That's interesting to hear that it kind of works like the relationship works kind of the other way.
So I think this is at least a way that Andy likes to work,
Hmm.
and I think if we look at the way he targets and the way he voices our products, is that I think he has a different direction that he wants to go in with each earphone, and and partially it is informed by the sort of chief characteristics of that driver, or at least how the drivers interact with each other. Um,
Right.
so so if he chooses a certain type of driver material, he might want to sort of accentuate certain aspects of that driver that he thinks is good, right? So I think there, for a lot of people, they think ringing is bad, right? In general, I think
Hmm.
the idea is that ringing in driver is bad. Um, but maybe that ringing sounds particularly euphonic in a certain way. I think Andy might try to find a certain signature that would sort of fit under that mode.
If it has those characteristics.
Yeah, if it has
Hmm.
those characteristics. Yeah. Um, so while I think a target curve is a nice idea to have, it's not necessarily the way, at least we design, and we don't always, go for that. Like, we don't tend to stray too far from what is generally accepted as a decent target curve, but we also try to sort of bring out what we think are nice properties of different drivers. I think actually the other day, I think you were interviewing ZMF,
Yeah.
and I think he was talking about something similar,
Hmm.
that there are certain things that he likes about certain types of drivers, and he doesn't want to get rid of certain properties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how, like, one of the reasons why he uses the different one of the reasons for the lineup that he has is because they're sort of like, what can I get out of this driver? I want something that has these characteristics from this driver. So it's interesting to hear there's kind of like a similarity there.
Mhm.
Just so everybody knows, Crin's having trouble with his mic, so he's going to try and fix that and troubleshoot it and come back on in a second. So in the meantime, I'll run with some more questions for Tom here. Um, so Joe, you were just talking about tuning into maybe a general target curve that has the
Mhm.
elevations in appropriate spots, but um, not being necessarily bound by that for the benefits or for the sake of letting the driver kind of indicate what might be best for it. But I wanted to ask about, we spoke about this a little bit ago, but I wanted to ask about, tuning preferences for different audiences, and how, the Luna might be more suited to one audience versus another. And it seems to me like, I mean, this isn't just like a one-off example. I think there's lots of examples of certain regions in the world, certain audiences valuing a different type of tuning from maybe the standard Harman preference curve, and that maybe some of this research actually has been done already. But I just wanted to get your take on what it's like to kind of hold those two ideas in mind of we want to tune maybe in a way that's optimal for this one market, this one target market, but then at the same time, we also want to keep the driver's characteristics, optimal for what it is. I just want to get your kind of take on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've definitely seen localized preferences to certain types of sound signatures. For example, we've been in the Japanese market for quite a while now, and their tastes are very slightly different from the tastes of people in mainland China, which is basically our largest market, and that's different further still from what is generally accepted in for say North America.
Right.
And I don't know if there's a straight answer to figuring out like why it is this way.
Right.
I think there are a lot of people who have said a lot of things about why this might be. Some people have said that in China they tend to value like a really girly sounding voice, and so upper mid frequencies are boosted more than they are not.
So it'd be like a cultural difference there for what's appreciated
Yeah.
in terms of the music and stuff like that.
Yeah. But I'm not sure it counts for all of these differences. So I'm really not sure. In general, I think what people tend to go for is a fairly even sound, right? And I think it has to deal, or personally, I think it has to do with how well or what types of like what excites us fundamentally in terms of music. And so, for instance, my personal preference is that I really enjoy really upfront vocals. So I'll see myself preferring earphones that really have like a nice boosted 800 to 2K region.
Right.
And so that really helps me center myself around the music, because I listen to a lot of stuff with usually a single vocalist and a lot of different instruments around it. But so maybe it is that a lot of people will tend to prefer different sound signatures in that way.
Right.
So
based
I
on
think
the music they're listening to and the things they enjoy in the music. Yeah.
And so like I think a lot of people have said that Chinese earphone makers tend to really like to boost that 2 to 4K region quite a bit. And I think maybe it is partially cultural, but perhaps it is also because of sort of a a historical vestige of the fact that a lot of these companies um, used to be OEM plants.
Hmm.
And so what they used to do was tune to a certain target curve, and what that target curve used to be was diffuse field or free
Right.
field, and so both diffuse field and free field tend to have quite a bit of boost in that 3 to 5K region, um, and so that might be partially it as well.
Right. Okay.
People are just used to tuning that way. That might be another reason why.
So it almost like borders on, people are used to hearing this a certain way because
Hmm.
things used to be tuned this way, and so that just became the norm.
Yeah.
Um, and then now that's just what, yeah, everybody sort of expects to hear. It's
Hmm.
kind of, I think somewhere Sean Olive is crying a little bit
Yeah,
um,
I mean, I don't have the right answer. I
yeah.
don't know what the answer is. But it definitely does seem to have well, I seem to have seen this with Japanese earphones
Hmm.
because what I s- what they used to do was tune very much to a sort of free field response.
Right.
Um, and so it was clear that Japanese earphones all had a very sort of similar curve right around 2 to 5K. Um, and 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 if sometimes if you looked at interviews with Japanese acoustic engineers, they would, sort of bring up the free field response curve. And that was the first time that I was sort of clued into, okay, maybe that might be why um, everyone just used to tune that way. Um, and eventually, they would shape their responses to sort of uh, suit their target audience better.
Right. I think we have Crin back now. I think he's on his phone. Hey, how's it going,
Okay.
man? Everything good?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Just turn.
Not sure why my PC is going haywire, but here I am on my phone.
All right, I'll just turn you up a little bit here. Um, Now that Corinne's back, we could maybe get into some of the measurements focused discussions because I had lots of questions for Corinne as well. And by all means, Corinne, if you have any questions for Tom or vice versa, feel free to jump in. But I wanted to get both of your guys' take on IEM measurements for a couple of reasons. But I'm not sure if everybody's seen this, but Jude posted recently an article on HeadPhi about the benefits of the B&K 5128 for measurements and the benefits of it over the traditional 711 standards. And for anybody who's watching, there's sort of been a traditional way of measuring headphones and IEMs with the 711 standard, but that was never really designed to be accurate up, above 8 to 10k hertz. And now with the 5128, we have accuracy for the entirety of the range there. And so Jude's point with this is that now we finally have a new measurement standard for accuracy, beyond what we were used to with the 711 standard. And it made me think because he posted a number of graphs there showing what I imagine is the half-wave resonance showing up for, I think it was like the W80 or W60 from Westone. And this is something that Corinne, you've written extensively about, and for how you're able to get consistency with the resonance there, which ends up showing up around like 8k hertz, and that this isn't as much of a problem necessarily as the variance shows. And then the other thing I was thinking about, maybe we can get to this, but it's is this something that the RA0 or 402 can fix? And does this kind of salvage the 711 standard a little bit, at least when it comes to IEM? So I'll direct that question to Corinne first of all, because we haven't heard from you yet, but this is for both of
Okay.
you guys.
Yeah, yeah, sure. The way that okay, to preface everything, I am not an audio engineer. I'm definitely, not learned in this topic. So my my perspective is that of an end user rather
Mhm.
than the actual researcher or academic that people expect me to be, but I'm actually not. So from what I'm seeing for the response of this Pro and Care 5128,
Yeah.
correct? My biggest issue is not really about the treble, it's about the bass response.
Mm.
And if you look at it across the board, all of the measurements that the 5128 generates all have this weird suppression of the
Yeah, I
bass
noticed that as well.
frequencies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jude
I have
argues,
I
or should I
have
say,
something to
even
talk about for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
sure. So Jude argues that it is more accurate, but the way that I see it is that it well, we have not put pen to paper on exactly what the human perception is versus the measured perception is. So from what I'm seeing, this is a very radical change. Not necessarily a change that I wholly agree with because we have been using the 711 standard for so long. It just makes no sense to change and change in the case of for the sorry against the case of precision because everyone else is using it. The data that has been generated now has all been on 711. Throwing another standard into the mix just muddies up the measurement waters all over again, and we're gonna go back to square one, where it's like, oh, you know what, this graph comes up, and people's gonna ask like, hey, this where did this come from? What standard is it on?
Right.
Which was the case for headphones, and was not actually the case for IEMs, because for the most part, whenever an IEM measurement comes up, you can almost always be assured that it would be on 711, unless it was a DIY and it's very obvious that the data was gathered on like a standard short copper tube or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So my case against the 5128 is not necessarily about its accuracy, which I am kind of doubtful for, but I can't say too much about it because I don't have the research with me right now. But rather, I'm arguing for precision. Where why go against this standard that everyone else has already adopted over the last 10 or 20 years?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really make too much sense. But this is HEAD5. Honestly speaking, whatever that they adopt, I don't think it's going to become the industry standard because they release 5 graphs a year. They don't have that much pull over the industry in this particular aspect, unless Jude magically manages to create a whole database all of his own. But in this case, most flat plate as well as other 711 DIYs are going to have more influence over this aspect at least.
Right. So it's more about the comparability aspects that make it useful for the end user than the ultimate
comparability as well as actually measuring.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really read data that doesn't
right
exist.
Availability of this stuff.
Yeah.
Tom, you'd mentioned that there was. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I'll let you finish there.
I mean, this is just like a final point. It's like, yeah, so you could have like this new 5128 with better accuracy or source purportedly better accuracy, but it's completely useless if you don't actually use it, or at least use it often enough. Because as far as I know, in terms of IEMs, I can count the number of IEMs that Jude has measured even on the RA0402 with 2 hands.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, let me start off by saying I think the research done by Brew and Care is really it's very elegant. And I think they've put in a ton of effort into producing this research, and by as a result they've made the 5128 from what they've done. But I want to remind everyone that irrespective of whether we use a 711, a RAO 402, or 5128, that these are all just tools. right? And earlier, I mentioned that our acoustic engineer, doesn't start off with that target curve, right? Right. He tries to figure out, what he wants out of his drivers and what he wants out of his sort of um, overall signature before he actually starts tuning to a curve.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so in most cases, for at least for I want to say boutique designers, which is 90% of companies that we talk about, um, uh, it's not that important uh, what the designer uses, right? Um, so it doesn't really matter, whether the 5128 is more accurate if a company or a hobbyist can get sort of consistent and reliable enough results from what they're using, right?
Right.
The important thing, though, is that we need to know what the limitations are for each sort of measurement rig or standard, right? So we must remind ourselves that when we're interpreting 711 coupler measurements, which are you know which are copious, uh, that it is not very reliable beyond 8 kilohertz.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that even below 100 hertz, I think there are discrepancies um, that can be identified. Uh, so 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 this is the kind of thing that I think we must be careful about. Like when we're talking about measurements, right? That when something is measured on a 711 coupler, it can't be reliable. Like we can't reliably extrapolate the measurement information into what we're hearing unless we have heard it ourselves. And
Right.
I think that's something that's very important for a lot of people who are just starting off in this hobby, right? A lot of people will ask me for measurements of our earphones, right? And we don't post them publicly usually, because it's very difficult to explain the intricacies of what they're seeing on
Right.
paper. Most people are not like Crin or not like who are used to seeing those measurements.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll often ask me, questions that maybe we might find very basic, but they haven't had time to really digest what it means to have uncompensated um, measurements, right? What it means to, what a half wave resonance means, or
Mm-hmm.
what a quarter wave resonance means. Uh, and if we, I think what we all should try to do is just educate more and get people to really understand what they're seeing on paper. Um, and and if we can get to that point, I think it doesn't really matter what we use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, until then, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that can crop up, right? So let me just use the example of the Luna, right? So Jude posted RA0402 measurements of the Luna a few months ago,
Right.
and that I think led to a lot of people thinking that it had um, severe roll off on in especially in the treble, right? And that's partially because what the RAO402 does is intentionally dampen any type of resonance peaks
Mm-hmm.
um, made or produced by the branching of the um, Zwislocki design, and so that leads to sort of people thinking, oh, maybe it has no treble, right? And I think anyone who's actually heard the Luna can will be able to say that no, it does have treble. It is relaxed, but it still has treble. And so I think when we don't know how to interpret something, such as an RAO402 measurement, right, it leads to a lot of um, room for misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think any rig, right, one can make the case that an RAO402 is better for certain types of measurements. So the reason why they actually wanted to dampen those resonances, which I believe is actually for measurement of distortion. So I think they started off with um, this design in the era of um, active noise cancellation, and companies trying to make better ANC systems.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was that it was difficult to really figure out what the distortion was when you had these huge distortion spikes, really just mudding up all of their measurements. And so what they wanted to do was just to have something that didn't have such strong resonance, so that they can actually get a better reading of what their noise levels were. And so maybe for that purpose, the RA0402 is or 04, it doesn't really matter. 0401, 0402,
Yeah.
0403.
40X.
They're all very much, yeah, they're all very similar. And they probably are better for the purposes of a headphone or earphone designer looking to implement active noise cancellation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one of the design goals for that type of coupler, right? The other thing was that Gross really didn't want to go away from their from their hats, and so they wanted something that was completely backwards compatible. And so if they wanted to do something that was fully anatomically correct, so for example, like the BNK,
Right.
5128, like they probably couldn't have done that with the 0402 system.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of considerations, even by measurement companies, to say, okay, we need a product for a certain type of application. How do we get this product to work for our clients? And I think that was definitely one of those goals, right? But as for us, people who are just listening to earphones, and hoping to get a sort of objective measurement, I do believe the onus is on us, as a community, to try to educate each other on what all of these measurements really mean. And so I think it's difficult, but I think it is a big challenge because it is very time consuming to actually explain all of these small intricacies.
I'm noticing that as well, especially for like over-ear headphones, and I'm running into, it's fascinating to learn about all this stuff because like every time I conduct another measurement, recognizing certain things that show up in a frequency response that you wouldn't expect to be there if you weren't familiar with the rig. So, and that's the other thing I was going to say, is that for a lot of this, I think it's also very important to publish or to tell people, what the rig is that's being used for the measurements and what that means. Because a lot of the time, if you see just, oh, here's what's supposed to be a flat line, and people, maybe they can understand that, but that doesn't accurately capture the reality of what's going on. I wanted to just briefly step back to something that Crin mentioned earlier about like base level for the 5128, and it just made me think that just like what Crin was saying, like because we don't necessarily have a baseline for how these measurements are anchored to our hearing. As in, we can recognize what's going on in the frequency response for different headphones and different IEMs, but that's mostly because we understand already. We have this comparative, like in Crin's case, a database there, and we know we have all those reference points. But without those reference points, it becomes a bit of a challenge to, for something like the B&K to come along and essentially start from scratch, because in many ways, when we're thinking of headphones measuring a certain way in the bass, for example, and having more bass than what the B&K shows, that's I wonder if that's largely because that's just what we're used to, or is it that it actually just sounds that way? And I think that's something that it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer. because I have this, and this is what I wanted to get to. It's because I have the same issue when comparing measurements of the 0045 and the RA 0402, where, and those are basically the two Gross sims. And I find myself in situations where I'll go back and forth on anchoring those measurements to my experience of whatever it is. Sometimes it sounds like the measurement of the 0045 is more accurate, and sometimes it sounds like the measurement of the RA 0402 is more accurate. And that's where the subjective element to me becomes so much more important, because everything ends up just being anchored not necessarily to what the accurate measurement is, but rather the reference points that you have from other IEMs and from other headphones. And so, yeah, I wanted to ask, I mean, I'll start with asking Crin this, but between the two, I mean, is there a reason for you to get on the RA 0402 train essentially for your database? Or, does that actually potentially add more issues, both because it would be challenging for the whole database, but also as far as accuracy is concerned for you?
The whole reason that I went with the 0402 is not really because of accuracy, but more because of I just want a bit of variance in my so-called measurement collection. So at least when someone says like, oh, do you have a RA0402 measurement of this, I can
Sure.
at least provide them the data. That is if I already have the IEM or headphone in my possession.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for the most part, my IEM database, which is currently has like 700, 800 entries, for future entries, I would still use my old coupler, because at the end of the day, it's a database.
Yeah.
Precision and consistency above all else. I don't really care about accuracy, because the whole point of my database is internal comparison. And throwing in the RA0402 measurements into the mix is just going to muddy up the waters even more.
Yeah.
In terms of subjectively, I would say yes, the traditional Zlowski 711 couplers always going to have extra resonance. It's I don't think people are going to deny that. The question is about the magnitude of the dampening required to keep it more in line with subjective human impressions. And as Thomas said, if you look at the Dunu Lunar graph on an RA0402, it looks dark. It just rolls off. But on subjective listening, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds all right. I don't think that it's bright. I don't think it's dark. I think it's kind of like in the middle. That's kind of like the
for the treble
simplest
response.
way I'll put it. Yeah, I wouldn't call it perfect, but but that is where the RA0402, or at least what I think is its shortcoming, where it seems like it's over dampening the resonance. And it does make the graph more readable, or should I say, it makes the measurement a little bit easier, because since the resonant peaks are so dampened, you don't have to consider insertion depth as you would with a traditional 711 coupler. But because of that, you get problems like this, where I'll say even on the MDR Z1R, the headphone, the one where Inner Fidelity and HeadPhi got into a spat over.
Right.
I don't think the peak is as large as the traditional headphone rigs suggest.
So this is like on the 10K, 9K hertz, 10K hertz issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would absolutely say that there is a peak there. I don't think it's as smooth as what the RA0402 rigs are showing. So there is a middle ground. But to say that the 0402 is the absolute pinnacle of accuracy is false, as you would see from HeadPhi's backpedaling on the RA0402 in favor of the 5128. And I mean, if you're on the topic of the 5128, it's quite interesting that HeadPhi chooses the Westone W60, an IM that I despise actually, for the reason that it measures exactly how I hear it, or at least my measurements. Because if you look at HeadPhone's measurements, it's neutral, it's flat, it's like almost perfectly flat, and that to me doesn't make sense because I hear it like how my measurements measure like, which is dark, it's warm, it's thick.
They all sound really warm and
There's
dark to me. Yeah.
there is so much emphasis on the lower harmonics and fundamentals to the point where everything just sounds so cloying and claustrophobic, and that is the W60 to me. So in this case, the human, in terms of the human impression, the human subjective impressions, the 5128 doesn't do it for me. It's not accurate for my own case. Again, as we've seen, just tiny variations in measurement rates is going to result in huge changes. And in the same vein, just tiny variations in one's own human biological internals are going to result in big sweeping changes as well. I mean, that's just a complicated way of saying that everyone hears things differently. So I can't speak for you, but I'm speaking for myself. For what I am from my perspective, analyzing the 5128 and the traditional 711, I think my hearing is much closer to that of the 711 and the RA0402. The 5128 always generates measurements that I don't know, just don't seem very accurate to me.
They're not as closely matching your experience.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people in the hobby likes to throw around the word of like, oh, this is subjective hobby, isn't it? So, yeah, this is me throwing in the subjective element into the objective measurement talk. The 5128 doesn't do it for me.
I see Tyler smiling up there in the corner.
Yeah. So I just sent everyone a link. And while I mean, obviously, we're not going to be doing like a journal reading here, but the link is basically to a paper that B&K's researchers published on what their findings were when they tried to test the ear canal impedance of all of their, I believe it's 44 different subjects that they tested. And in it is, and this is something that I think is really valuable. It's actually the raw data from this research, not actually the 5128 itself. What they ended up doing in the research was they compared the average ear canal impedance of the subjects they tested against what the impedance of the 711 coupler was. And so they started to identify what the differences were. And I think that's when they started realizing that they needed to redesign the coupler from the ground up. So regarding sort of the bass and how the 5128 seems to underestimate the bass, it is reflected basically in the research itself that there is a deviation of the ear canal impedance in the bass frequencies, starting from around, I want to say 200 hertz, all the way down to 35 hertz, which is basically the lower limit of what B&K tested. And there's a deviation between 1K to 5K, in which it results in, if you look at the diffuse field response of the B&K, it's not called hats. What do they call it? The B&K, it's I don't remember what they call it.
I thought it was
their
called
head, their head and torso simulator actually has a different diffuse field response from what it originally was in the 4128C. And because it reflects these differences between their new sort of target response and the old one that was based off the 711 standard. So actually, I highly recommend that you guys take a look at the differences, because I think it's very revealing what the differences are between real ears and what the 7-Eleven is, and sort of it actually I think it will actually help Kryn in identifying how maybe in the future he could target his resonances
Hmm.
to try and get even more consistent findings, right? Because one of the advantages of the research that they did was that they took um, they 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 made occluded ear molds of each subject, right? And they targeted a very specific distance to the ear canal, or to the eardrum.
Hmm.
And basically, they tried to find this happy medium around 22 millimeters, which is usually right around the first and second bends of the ear canal. And even then, they had trouble sort of getting that exact target. Um, because for comfort's sake and just measurement variations. But what they tried to do was that they always tried to target a half-wave resonance of around 9.4 kilohertz, and they've reached that frequency number from averaging and analyzing all of their different data points, to see, okay, 9.4 kilohertz is around what everyone's uh, uh, half-wave resonances
Hmm.
are. And so this is actually very telling because this means that there is a range of different half-wave resonances between different ears, right? If you actually go in and look at the data, right, what they actually do to get everyone's um, half-wave resonance to align at 9.4 kilohertz was they use a differential equation called the Webster's Horn equation, and then what they put a two-dimensional extension to that equation, because the Horn equation is usually one-dimensional, and they end up calculating sort of, if I have a resonance at this specific frequency and I try to move all of the frequencies upward or low or downward, like how would all of these frequencies change? And they use this equation to try to do that. And that's how they got everything to align similarly. And I think what we can actually do, and maybe if B and K end up being very, very generous, they'll actually, do an applet, and 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 be able to um, help 7-Eleven users
Right.
sort of recalibrate their findings to what their 5128 findings are, right? It won't be exactly the same, but I think we will get closer to having comparable measurement.
the that I mean, to me, it's still, there's always that question of agreement with experiences and where those
Yeah.
are anchored to. And but what you're saying then, I mean, from this paper, was it that they took subjective reports of like what people were saying was more or less emphasized for bass response? Was that where that came from?
No, no.
Okay.
This is actually from the impedance measurements that they did, right?
Oh,
So
so they
so
actually,
they
okay, from individual
yeah.
people. I get what you're saying.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
a second I thought this was more like some of the Harmon research, but actually like they took the actual ear from a number of different subjects. I gotcha.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
This is anatomical research that
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they
yeah.
did a frequency sweep from 35 to from 35 hertz to I think 25 kilohertz
Right.
for every single person, right? And I think there are some issues with the B&K research, and I should just point that out really quickly.
Hmm.
Um, I think first of all, the population was very, very homogenous. So
Mm.
the B&K engineer told me that they were basically the test subjects were all B&K employees, and that makes sense, right?
I thought you could say they
You're
were
not
all
gonna be
base
able to
heads.
yeah. So they took these 44 people, right? And they were basically all of Danish descent. Um, and I think there is a measure of, like different population, uh,
Hmm.
yeah, population level differences between different sort of ethnic groups in terms of ear anatomy. Um, and so So I think that is a question mark, right? The sample that they're taking from is very, very local to one area of the globe. Is this data necessarily applicable to the rest of the world?
Mm-hmm.
That remains to be seen, right? There's not enough data out there to indicate that, what they found is not applicable, but there's not enough data to say that it is.
Right.
So, yeah. So that's a big question mark. The other question mark is they use occluded molds, right? So basically like a custom in-ear monitor stuck inside each subject's ears. How does that necessarily change sort of the way standing waves interact
Right.
within the ears, right? Because I think what we're seeing in the 5128 responses is that because they're using a anthropometric ear canal, right? We're seeing a lot of sort of shaky, squiggly differences in the bass and the lower mid range, right? And that has to do with the fact that the ear canal is bent and that it is squishy, right? And the mathematics of what they used was that the Horn equation itself is supposed to be applicable only to a non-deformable structure, so a fully solid structure, right? And I realized the complexity of the math involved would be just enormous if they
Right.
tried
How
to
do you get the
account
variance
for.
and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's a big concern, right? Like how does cartilaginous tissue,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also, at least to the inner part of the ear canal, how does the bony part and the cartilaginous tissue contribute to the change in sort of the way we perceive bass frequencies and even
Right.
treble frequencies? I think this is a big. It's not easy to answer, right? And I think B&K have done a very admirable job of trying to answer these questions, but obviously, there's never a perfect way of doing the science.
Right. I mean that seems like a very interesting like methodological point where I mean on two of those I mean the like the custom in-ear design, I mean that on its own I think would indicate some sort of difference there. But yeah, Crin, I wanted to get your take on some of this stuff. Both that, but also I have another question for you afterwards as well, because I was just thinking about different headphones having or different IEMs showing at least as far as the measurement is concerned on both the 711 both versions of the 711 and also the 5128, and how the different measurements will potentially either as a result of the damping, right, they'll potentially either show a false null or they will miss on the other side of it. So if you're using the 0045, you'll see the peak there that isn't necessarily there, and with the RA402 and now potentially the 5128, you have an opportunity, or you potentially see you miss something like that, and this causes certain issues because not all headphones or IEMs have a bump at the same place, or they don't all elevate or dip right in that area. And so this I think is something where this goes back to Tom's point, where you really need to communicate. everybody who's doing these kind of measurements really needs to work hard to try and communicate what this means and where the differences will lie. But we can get to that. I wanted to get first your take on what Tom just mentioned about the 5128 and the bass response.
Okay, the bass response.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just go back to what I was thinking when I was reading this paper, because I think I've just read through, or at least quite briefly, what paper was. At the end of the day, most of us are going to read the graphs in a sort of semi-compensatory way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even in the IEM's world, where compensations are not that popular, there's still some form of internal compensations that every one of us is going to engage in whenever we look at a raw graph.
Yeah.
And in terms of headphones, there's always going to be diffuse field, Harman, and free field, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these target curves, all of these compensation curves are all derived based on the rig that they are generated on, correct? So if you have a grass rig or a grass schema, it's the diffuse field response is going to be derived out of that specific schema.
Yep.
If you have hats from Brew and Care, it's gonna the DF response is going to be generated based off of that dummy hit. So it is because of this that's why I think having something like the 5128 is not going to be that much of an issue, because when you recompensate it back into a neutral target curve, for example, the 5128
Right.
compensated to the 5128 diffuse target curve, it's going to look somewhat similar to the grass schema's compensated DF curve, right? Or am I missing something like because it seems like this is a simple solution. Just use the calibrated target curve that the manufacturer provides you, and you should get a similar-ish compensated curve afterwards.
With potential for more accuracy.
Yeah, I mean, accuracy
it would
is
be
a separate one,
applicable.
Yeah.
I think that would be applicable for frequencies not above, like, say 6 kilohertz, because that's when really the when
yeah.
we start getting
This is
those
more like
approximations.
addressing. Yeah, this is more like addressing the base issue.
Mhm.
So
Yes,
the base
yes.
issue should be compensated out the moment you put in like their own calibrated diffuse field target. But
I
in
agree.
terms of the treble, like that one is okay. For me, when it comes to treble, precision takes even more of a priority.
Mhm.
Like I don't really care about accuracy above 6K, 7K, 8K, or wherever the resonant frequency is. And that's another, not say problem, that I have with the Brew and Care paper. In fact, I think it is much more indicative of what I'm doing, is that even in a research paper such as this, they are normalizing the resonant frequency at 9.4. This is very crucial, because I know a lot of people have been giving me flack for saying like why do I publish measurements at a specific resonant frequency when different IMs fit differently or whatever. No, it's all about precision. Even Brew and Care does it. Everyone else who's doing a paper does it. They have to normalize the resonant frequency, else you cannot differentiate between coupler resonance and driver resonance, and that is even worse, especially when it comes to something. Well, it's not as bad on the RA0402 because there is no resonance, or at least there's very minimal resonance point. And so with regards to the RA0402, what was the question again with regards to that?
Just more so on when we have say in did we lose Crin? I think we lost Crin. I'll defer to Tom on that question for now. But basically, there's situations where you have maybe there's a peak there at 8K hertz, and then you use something like Quinn's back. Okay, I'll rephrase. We good?
Yeah. Sorry.
So I'll give you an example. Maybe we have an IEM that has a peak there at 8K hertz, and you have something like an RA0402 that dampens it, and what you're saying is that there's a potential that it can over dampen this, and then we're not just showing information or data that's potentially not accurate above 8K hertz or at 8K hertz because of this damping, but then also it's potentially misleading. The flip side of this, I think, would be if you have something that shows say you're measuring the same IEM on an RA or on the 0045 that has the coupler resonance there. This is going to show the more strong elevation for that same peak that exists there. I think the question in my mind is, which is sort of the lesser of two evils here? Do we overrepresent something that exists there, or do we underrepresent it? Right? If in the case of the RA 0402.
I think both of them have their own uses. So for an expert user, I would say that having something with the resonant peaks undampened would be more useful.
Okay.
Because
Because at least then you can
at that
see.
case,
Yeah.
yeah, and you have to provide the necessary information in order for them to understand like
Mm-hmm.
how they can better interpret the data. For example, you can tell them like, oh, you know what, this insertion depth results in a resonant frequency of 10.4 kilohertz, and
Yes,
then you
exactly.
look
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
graph and be like, oh, there you go. But
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the layman, in terms of the average graph user who probably isn't fully aware of all of these minor nuances, then probably the RA0402 would be, as you said, the lesser of two evils. But
Right.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think the bad side happens when you misinterpret the data.
Right.
Especially when it comes to something like this where there's intentional damping, and then you pretend like, oh, you know what, the traditional 711 coupler has this peak, the RA0402 the RA0402 doesn't have it. In fact, it shows nothing, and therefore the RA0402 it's the more accurate one, and my impressions matter more because my impressions line
Mm-hmm.
up more with the RA0402, and I think that is a very dangerous trap to be in, because your opinion on the sound is not dictated by the newest, shiniest toy on the measurement market.
Right. Right. You can't let the measurements indicate.
Justify your
Yeah.
opinions,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
least pretend that your opinions are of a higher quality than others, because
Right.
that's like, being yeah, just being an asshole.
Yeah. Fair enough. Um, I want to. We've been going now for about an hour and a half, but I want to get some questions from the chat. Um, Tyler, I think you're still muted on your mic. Let's see if we can unmute Tyler here, and maybe we can pull some questions from the chat. Unless, oh, there we go. Yeah. Unless first, do either Crin or Tom, do you guys have any questions for one another, or I can start it off with you guys, and then we can move to the chat.
Well, I mean, like I think we might have had this conversation before. So like Corinne and I like know each other from before, but like I always was unsure why um you chose that 8 kilohertz um target.
The
Um,
normalization there.
I think it's something of like from
Oh,
about like
I did it.
that.
I chose 8 because it was the easiest to hit
Uh-huh.
consistently. That's it. That's it.
Because of
There is no,
like the length of the coupler and all that stuff, right? Like it's
yes.
like the
Yep.
most like okay. All right, that's what I thought. Okay.
The
I know,
easiest
I
to
just wanted to
hit.
make sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And when I tell people this, they sort of being like, oh my god, this is wrong. Like, you can't just choose the one that is the easiest to hit. And I'm like, no, I just want to hit 8. That's it.
Right.
I don't need anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying about the equation, right? The equation that they
Mm-hmm.
use to sort of propagate, to sort of shift resonant frequencies, that's actually very
Mm-hmm.
useful, right? If anyone needs to shift their resonance frequencies to align with your measurements, or they want to shift your measurements to align with what they hear,
Wait,
um,
did they share it
that's
yet?
actually a
Like, is
useful tool. No, I don't think so. You actually have like
oh
like in order to do
yeah
those calculations,
they
you'd
yeah
have
they
to
yeah
have like like COMSOL, finite element analysis, all that good stuff. Um,
yeah
yeah.
maybe
So
one
so
day, maybe one day.
yeah, yeah. But that would be actually very, very valuable to try and figure out, why. Like, because a lot of people come to me, right? Um, and say like, oh, I hear a peak at this frequency, right? And then the other person's like, no, I don't hear that. Like, it's higher up. And there's a never-ending debate
Yeah.
about who hears what at what frequency, right? And I think this is one of those things where one day we should try to find a means of trying to reconcile these differences, right? It might not be a perfect means of doing it, but we should try to find one. And I hope this is what I hope, like from this research, that a company, maybe it's B&K, maybe it's someone else, they will find a way to try to let us at least get clued in on why we hear these things differently, right? Part of it stems from the fact that not all of us can fit in ears in at the same depth,
Right.
right? So one of the things that I try to do whenever I fit in a new earphone is that I actually do try to fit it in as deeply as possible, but not everyone tries to do that. I would say most people just try to fit it in to a depth at which they're most comfortable.
Yeah, comfort.
Yeah. Um, and that I think contributes to a lot of differences in the way they hear things. And then maybe this will segue into like whether tips and how tips affect sound and all that good stuff. But first, I think what I want to say is that even in the data that B&K published, we noticed that people with highly variable canal sort of diameters will end up having more variances in the way their
Yeah.
resonance peaks are manifested in the measurements. And so like maybe someone with a tapering ear canal versus someone with a canal that ends up getting bigger, these things will all affect the way the ear canal impedance will be measured.
Yeah, of course.
And that will inevitably translate to differences at least at the eardrum. But let's not forget the fact that our auditory system is not just the external ear. Our auditory system extends all the way to the brain, and there is a lot of processing that goes on there to try and smooth out these differences. And there's a reason why like we are so well programmed to detect babies crying and other frequencies. These are things that happen exclusively within the brain and the inner ear. Um, and so this is an extremely complex question that we can't just solve with saying, oh, we have a better measurement system now. And so while I think, yes, it's great that they have a new system, I think it's just even better if we could just use what we've learned and continue to educate people on what we know now, how to interpret the data that we have existing, and and how do we continue to get better at interpreting this data. And personally, I just feel that that's the direction that we should move in, right? Personally,
Yeah.
to me, I don't think it's particularly important about to debate over what people should be using, because it's not like it's about how well we can interpret this data and how well do we know and how do we know what we still don't know. So every single time I read one of these papers, and I've read a lot of them over the years, I just feel like there's always one or two new things that I'm not sure about, right? And things that I previously thought I knew, now I don't. And so I think it's very important to acknowledge, for everyone to acknowledge what they don't know.
Right.
And that's, I think, a more healthy attitude to take when approaching a hobby as sort of uncertain as audio.
Right. Definitely. It's funny that just you mentioned the shape of the ear canal and all that. This is something that actually I see Metal 571 in the chat, and we've talked about this a lot, and I've talked to Crin about this as well. But given all the mental apparatus that's going on with compensating for the various different resonances and gain factors that our ears have, you'd think that there would be more agreement there for how we hear things. But as it turns out, it feels to me at least that with IEMs, there's so much more variance and disagreement. You know, and I wonder if part of this has to do with there being less or being fewer gain factors with IEMs compared to over-ear headphones. Again, I asked Crin the same question, but you know, to me, it seems like there could be two answers to this. One could be, you know, now that there's now that there's fewer gain factors, they matter more. But the other could be also that there's now there's more actual physical interaction with one of those gain factors, meaning that, you know, for insertion depth and stuff like that, and, you know, how far in you can push the IEM, that actually does, like, in some cases maybe it'll actually, you know, push up against the ear canal, and or you know, for edemotic stuff, you know, it goes really far in. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a pretty simple explanation for that, which is like, okay, so for a headphone, the reference. Okay, so for the reference point is always a two-channel system, right, or speakers or whatever you call it. And for headphones, you are immediately bypassing the head and the torso. So that is the gain factor that the manufacturer, or should I say the driver, the diaphragm or the system itself, has to guess for you. So if they guess wrongly, or should I say, if their guess is not this is not what should I say, does not hit your actual gain factor, then the headphone sounds unnatural.
Yeah.
Now, contrast this with IEMs, where now you're not only just bypassing the head and the torso, you're also bypassing the pinna flange as well as part of the ear canal. So now the earphone itself, the manufacturer and whoever else, has to guess the gain factor of all of these components for you specifically. So that means that an IEM that sounds natural for one person would probably not sound that natural for another person, simply because the IEM itself is basically has to compensate for all of this missing gain factor.
Because you don't have them, they're bypassed, and that makes perfect sense. That's something I hadn't thought about before.
So ER4, the ER4 is just going to be an averaged response. It's diffuse field, sure, but it's diffuse field made out from most likely a grass schema or whatever. So it's going to emulate the average, and for most people, we're not going to be average. We're going to be close. But some of us may be outliers, and therefore something like ER4 may not sound very natural. But you give something like really wonky, or at least in theory very wonky, you give it to them, and they say, "Oh, it sounds very natural now." And in that sense, I can get it, because, like, yeah, you know what? You have different ears, or should I say, it's not just you have different ears. You have a different head, you have a different body. All of this contributes to you getting a different sound. Yeah.
This is sort of like, it's kind of like the opposite of what I was thinking. Like, it's all the rest of the gain factors that now have to be assumed, because that's what your personal HRTF has been, or, you know, what your brain has been compensating for all along. And now that that's no longer a factor, you know, it has to be assumed, and that can lead to, you know, variance. That's fascinating.
Basically, I agree with what Crin is saying. That's exactly, basically, he couldn't have put it better. One of the things that I would add is that, you know, we as humans were not, you know, we weren't meant to have our ears occluded, right? We were meant to have our ears fully opened and listening to all our environmental cues. And so that's what our brains are most attuned to. And so when we take that away, right, everything sort of starts getting into the uncanny valley, right? In the sense that if we're simulating all these things and they're not simulated in a way that we're used to, then nothing sounds quite right. And that's one of the reasons why some people who are very used to speakers, they just can't ever get used to headphones or earphones, right? And when they do get into them, like, they're not always the most consistent sort of judges of what good or bad is, because they just can't get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, what, from the manufacturer side, I think this is the challenge and almost the art of tuning, right? When we try to tune things, right, uh, we are supposing that our intended response is going to appeal to the people that we most desire to purchase this item, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and so if it works, right, then it will be a product that really that people really resonate with, and that they'll want to purchase. um and but it's one of those things that I don't think no one manufacturer will get it right every single time.
Mm-hmm.
um and so as a manufacturer, I think it's very important that we try to um we're always willing to look inwards and see where we can try to tweak things.
Right.
um and luckily, I think, like, we as a company, like, we're always trying to do that. And so we've been fortunate enough to try, to gain enough feedback that we can do certain types of responses, and that a good number of people will really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
um the second layer beyond just tuning for different, anatomies and different HRTFs is that, um, there's the coloration of music is actually very important. I think, most of us speaking here today tend to want to go for a more neutral response, but really not, like, not everyone wants that.
Yeah.
A lot of people really want excitement. They want to hear something different. Um, and
Mostly bass.
so, or what? Or
Mostly
what?
bass.
Bass. Yeah.
Yeah, mostly bass. But not always. Sometimes it's, other components to music, and I think that is the trick, for companies to try to build products that do appeal to sub-segments of the population. Um, no one earphone is ever going to satisfy everyone.
Right. So it's more prudent to sort of have a little bit more of a scattered approach to
Yeah.
what targets you're trying to hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes actually a lot of sense. And this is, like, I've talked about this in the past, but it's like the what Malcolm Gladwell was talking about with developing flavors of spaghetti sauce, and how one flavor of spaghetti sauce is not actually what we want, and it's the wrong idea to try and just develop for one type of preference. We really need to just look at what emerges from the data for people's preferences, and then develop for all of those.
Yeah.
But we've been going for quite a bit now. I know Tyler has to go at around noon, so I wanted to just see if we could maybe jump in and get a few of the questions from the chat here. We could, I'm sure, keep going on for a long time. I have actually so many more questions for you guys, but
and I can always jump off and you can continue.
No, well, yeah, we also have to cut it at around noon, anyways, just because of podcast length. But was there anything that jumped out from the chat that we want to talk about?
They've been kind of just having a chat, to be honest.
Having a chat, right on. It's good to see everybody in there, by the way.
Yeah, a lot of really good people in there. There was a question early on, I believe, for Tom regarding carbon fiber.
Oh yes, I saw that.
IEMs, and so that's the only one that really stood out right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
Also, someone asked about Kren's IEM tip preference. But I pointed them in the direction of where he already makes those statements. So
awesome.
So unless there's any other questions in the thread that come up now, go ahead and ask them now, and we'll start to.
I see one on THD.
Sure. Yeah, we could hit. Well, yeah. Why don't we do that, and then we'll get Tom to answer on the carbon fiber question.
So yeah, let me really
Oh,
quickly
okay.
address that. So I assume from what he's saying is that he wants a diaphragm that is made from carbon fiber, right?
That's potential.
And okay, so I think there are a few issues with that, right? First of all, if you look at least for in-ears, right, diaphragms are basically anywhere from as small as 3 millimeters to as large as 16 millimeters, right? These are the two extremes, and they're usually around 8 to 10 millimeters in size, right? That is not actually the real size, right? Everyone counts the entire system, so they don't account for the surround, right? If we want to use something like carbon fiber, it's exclusively for the center dome portion, and and that would further subtract, at least a couple of millimeters from the ends, right? So let's say you start off with a 9 millimeter driver, right? You would have to have a circle of, around 6.5 millimeters in diameter, right? Um, and I don't think I don't think carbon fiber actually um, comes that small, right? You actually have to have woven fibers put together and impregnated in a particular resin material to get that specific strength, right? They talk about different, like if anyone's into bikes or race cars, right? They talk about different layups to carbon fiber. This is actually, quite thick, and I don't think we can get a driver to that, level of, to that level of thickness. I think the mass would be too high. Um, we would have to use like an extremely strong magnet, and it'd just be really difficult to drive. Not to mention the fact that carbon fiber doesn't exist on its own, right? It exists with that resin. And how does that resin actually affect the way it reproduces sound? So I think there are a lot of challenges to having a carbon fiber diaphragm driver. And that's why I would say most earphone manufacturers tend to go toward different types of coating.
Right.
And that's what,
See, like
helps.
Graphene was I was gonna say would be a
Yeah.
interesting one.
Yeah.
I saw the one
Graphene.
from with the carbon nanotubes on the
carbon nanotubes.
yeah, on the Starfield and all those as well.
Yeah. We've had a carbon nanotube driver earphone as well. And we actually look at like these coatings are actually all available to pretty much every single manufacturer, right? Because they're mostly industrial coatings. They've just been reappropriated for audio use.
Right.
And I think the trick is to get these coatings uniform enough and at a sufficient thickness so that it actually takes on its properties, right? We can't use like a 1 micron thickness coating and just call it a day, because then the diaphragm would just be, like it'd be slightly different from its base substrate, whether it's PET, PK, PEN, or whatever. It would still not be enough, right? And so that's one of the things. Like everyone, I think beryllium these days is a hot topic. People start talking about how, this thing has a beryllium driver, that thing has a beryllium driver, right? And all of them are all pretty much coated using a process called PVD. But even within that process, there are different variants, and so whether you can coat it to 3 microns or to 5 microns or to even thicker, because there are tricks to get even thicker than that. like how uniform is that coating? I think that all factors into whether this thing actually behaves like beryllium. And so to the average consumer, I don't think most of them understand that. And so a lot of the times, some manufacturers will sort of take advantage of this lack of understanding. And so I think that's one of the things that people should be wary of, that
Right.
not all drivers are created the same.
Right. On the subject, there's a lot of questions about materials and stuff like that. But Android actually asks, Tom, have you seen any of the super thin spread toe carbon fiber materials coming out of Sweden? He says they've made some tweeter drivers recently as well. Yeah.
I don't really know. Yeah.
Okay. It's just I see there's so many questions.
Apologies to Android. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
it's a lot of interesting.
I have another question for Tom as well. With the way that the Chi-Fi segment has been developing and encroaching even mid-fi, at least as far as pricing is concerned, I assume that's what this is about. Do you see in the future a lot of the IEM market do you see the future of a lot of the IEM market in China, or is it just like current trend? I think that's what this person's asking.
Right now, China should already be the largest market for IEMs.
Yeah, that's what I would assume as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons is that China is just urbanizing at an extremely rapid pace, and so people just have found the use cases to get ever better or to use audio equipment that is ever better, and so as manufacturers, it's incumbent upon us to rise to that challenge, right? Like people want better sound, and how do we get there? And I think that's what all manufacturers are trying to do. At least they're trying to offer products that potentially will yield better sound than we did 6 months ago or 12 months ago. The only issue is that the pace of development and there's such a wide spread of manufacturers that it's so difficult to navigate through everything, right? And so I think eventually we'll get to a point where the market there will start coalescing together, and we'll start to find or start to identify various different brands that really do try to work on not just their product but also their service and also the the overall experience of the brand, because to me that's what sets a lot of these companies apart, in terms of sound and sound reproduction. There's not a lot separating one company from another. So the key is after sales service and all of that stuff, right? I think it's the same anywhere in the world. And so the same will be in China.
Right.
I don't know if that answered the question, but
yeah, no, I think it does. It's funny. Tyler says Canada will be the next manufacturing hub. I think that's doubtful. There'll be like 5 of us sitting here and making stuff. On the subject of the THD, this is a question that I was hoping to get both your guys' take on. But for both, Tom and Crin, opinions on THD measurements. What's the percent at which a headphone or IEM's distortion becomes a problem in your mind? And also, is there a correlation between low THD and ability for extreme EQ? So, like for example, planar magnetic or electrostatic headphones, that kind of thing. I'll let Crin start off with this one.
Okay, so I've actually performed some personal experiments myself where I've manually added harmonic distortion through DAW. And when I did that, I tried to manually calculate like how many decibels is like 0.1%, 0.5, 1%, 3%. And for a pure tone, like just listening to like 200 hertz tone versus a 1K hertz tone, I think my threshold is about 3 to 5%. I forget which one it was. And with music, it goes all the way up to 10% to 15%.
Right.
So if you're talking about just raw harmonic distortion, especially when you're talking about harmonic distortion that's focused mainly around second harmonic, third, and fourth, it is very non-destructive. Like, yeah, it's very non-destructive. There's not a lot of, you need a lot of harmonic distortion for it to be noticeable, at least from my experiments. And in terms of whether or not there is a correlation between low THD versus sound quality, I personally don't see
Sorry,
any
no, it was
hard links.
It was EQ ability, but yes, that's another interesting one.
Oh, yeah, like EQ ability. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the distortion is based out of. So, for example, if you have an open back headphone, there's distortion in the bass regions, and in those cases, it's just simply the fact that the drivers are not designed to be driven in an open air environment, and therefore, no matter how much bass or how much EQ you add to this driver, you're not going to get the desired bass response. It's just not going to happen. But if talking about IEMs is a naturally sealed environment. In theory, you should be able to EQ every single IEM properly. But that's not the case because there's something that I'll call BA timbre, BA bass, if you will. And regardless of how much you EQ up a BA woofer's presentation, you're not going to get the same effect as you would with a standard dynamic driver.
Yeah.
You could explain this on the THD charts. For example, most BA woofers tend to have very high distortion, very high, specifically third harmonic distortion. But very high is still relative in this case, because when I say very high, it's still like 0.7%. So your typical dynamic driver could hit like 0.01% or even lower than that, depending on the implementation and the materials and all that. But relatively speaking, yes, BA drivers tend to distort a lot, again, relatively speaking. But I don't think that is a one-to-one explanation, like a full explanation of what the hell is going on with the whole BA timbre thing.
Right.
Because as I've said, like the experiments that I've created in pure tones, 3-5%. But in music, which is what we all listen to, it takes a lot of lower order harmonic distortion for it to be audible. If you're talking about higher order, like I don't know, 10th harmonic distortion, in that case, I hear it. You can hear it at like 2%. It's quite easy. But for the driver-specific distortion, which typically manifests themselves in the very, very lower orders of harmonic distortion, nah, I don't see it. I don't see that correlation, unfortunately.
Okay. Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So in general, I would say I agree with Crin in that the way we hear, we can actually tolerate a lot of distortion. The real value in seeing low harmonic distortion figures is just a general indication of how much work was put into this driver. And so basically, like, one of the things is that in general, like if we look at a driver that has been designed carefully, it will usually have not only less distortion, but also less ringing in the registers that really matter.
Right, that's more frequency response related,
Yeah,
though. Yeah.
yeah. And so these things are just general indications of how much care was put into designing a particular driver, right? But in terms of the outputted harmonic distortion, our hearing systems can actually tolerate a lot of distortion. And so, for instance, at I think at 120 decibels, our own auditory system produces distortion.
Interesting.
And so yeah, and so if the earphones themselves are producing that same amount, like we're not going to be able to detect it out of the same amount of distortion that we're hearing.
Right.
And so we are able to tolerate a lot of distortion, but it doesn't mean that it's not audible. There are certain earphones that do have recognizable distortion. They don't necessarily ruin the listening experience, but if you know where to listen to it, like you'll usually hear like this odd rustling in places that where rustling sounds shouldn't show up. Like I think there was a model a few years ago. I believe it was the Audio-Technica LS200, and that had pretty
that one.
audible, yeah, pretty high distortion measurements in the most sensitive band of human hearing, which is around like 1 to 4K, and at least for that earphone, it is audible. Like you can definitely hear at normal to high listening volumes clues as to what the distortion is, but it will not ruin the listening experience at all. So does that really matter? I don't know. Now, addressing the whole thing about EQ, I don't necessarily think, especially in the way parametric EQs work these days, that it's really going to matter, because if it's working right, you're essentially taking away signal rather than
Right.
than you're adding to signal. So I don't necessarily think that it's going to necessarily contribute a lot to sort of the distortion.
Mm-hmm. Um, we this is all fascinating. I wish we had more time, but I do have to cut it fairly short here, just because of we run out of time for doing podcasts in the audio format. But I have one final question for both of you guys, and it's a lot of the time there's concerns about. I see this in the comments for videos that I do on IEMs all the time. There's concerns about some maybe something is like $1,000 IEM or $2,000 IEM, like a fairly high end IEM, and people get concerned about material cost. And the comment that I usually see is, it can't be worth the $1,000 that the price tag is, because there's no way that the material cost is anything close to that. And of course, I always tend to think, we can't. I mean, at no point in any industry is material cost something that's relevant to how much it should cost. But what's your guys' take? I think that a lot of people, when they are concerned about this, they probably just don't understand what's involved in both research and development, and then bringing stuff to market. I wanted to get your take on sort of that concern that people seem to have.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me try and get it really quickly. So, let me use the example of the Luna. A few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago or so, someone who used to work in the industry and is now a reviewer, sort of posted privately on a chat channel somewhere that they said that it cost us, I think, the equivalent of around $120 US to build a set of Luna drivers, right? And if if we just count the pure raw material cost for the driver of the Luna, it is in that territory, right? And so one might be thinking, like, if it only costs around that much, why are we charging 10 times as much for that IEM, right? That's a very valid question. But at the same time, just a tooling cost that we've put in for to give to Materion over the last 3 years, just tooling costs cost us well over almost $120,000 US, right? That's just for the tooling, not to mention the fact that we need to operate the factory over those few years, and the fact that we need to pay our engineers an equitable amount of salary. Yeah. So like, these are all realities of operating a company, and I think it's very easy to look at just one component of the cost and say, oh my gosh, that's a ripoff. But if you factor into all these things, I think it becomes a lot more understandable that something like the Luna costs so much. And from the goal of the company, at least for Dunu, has been two things. Number one is to always try to innovate in this sector. And I think we've shown that time and time again that we've done things to try to push things forward for in-ears. The other thing is to always try to give value. And while it can be argued that the Luna is not, in a monetary sense, not a great value, but I think we've learned a lot from the development of Luna, such that future products can really stand to benefit. And a lot of that has to do with some of the things that I alluded to before. For example, the way we figured out how to glue the surround to the diaphragm, and all of that stuff, right? That's all going to trickle down. And very soon you're going to start seeing products that's are benefiting from what we learned.
Awesome. Crin, do you have any thoughts on material cost? And maybe you haven't seen these concerns, or maybe you have. I'm not sure.
I'm gonna address the part where you said about why, or should I say, the commenters have talked about why IEMs would be similar in price to headphones, even though headphones have a lot more quote unquote material in them. I have a very simple analogy. Phones and laptops. Why are phones the same priced the same as some of the mid-tier laptops? It's for the same reasons. Miniaturization is going to cost some cash. It's not like the world revolves around pure material costs like it was the prehistoric era. Like, there's going to be, as Thomas said, there's going to be a lot of little things that go beyond just simply the material costs, such as R&D, tooling, other fixed costs that they have to consider. And while there are definitely going to be unscrupulous manufacturers who overprice a lot of their things without any proper justification beyond, I just want to earn more money and I can. For the most part, there is a lot of thought that goes into the pricing of a product, be it an IEM, a headphone, or anything else for that matter. Because there are going to be considerations for what kind of market you're going to enter in whenever you price a product. So if you price it very expensive, you're going to be entering a very niche market. It's going to be a very high margin, low volume operation, and you have to build your sales around that strategy. And it's the same for if you were to price it low. In that case, you'll be entering not necessarily a mainstream market, maybe it's a slightly more prosumer market, and therefore you'll be a slightly lower margin but a slightly higher volume operation. So I do get that there is a concern where I know some people have looked up Mauser and DigiKey and see like, oh my god, this EV driver just costs $20, and yet Atomotic is charging $300 for their ER4. Whereas what they don't see is that in order for Atomotic to get that level of QC, where they match, I think, 20 hertz all the way to 3K hertz, they have to bin like 50 or so drivers for every single pair of ER4s.
Right.
And because of that, they have to raise the price, because that 50 drivers either go into their lower end, their lower range, where they can price cheaper for obviously less matching rigor, or they just simply dump it away. But most companies don't just dump it away. They just keep it away and maybe use it for a future project or whatever. But for that ER4, that cost is those 50 or so drivers that you've binned away. And therefore they have to raise the price, even though the drivers themselves, yes, cost $20 each. But just because the drivers themselves cost that much, and while you as a DIYer can theoretically build an ER4 yourself, it's probably not gonna be to that level of channel matching, or not even channel matching, like matching to that specific Atomotic target curve, because they match both ways. It's both unit variation control as well as channel matching control. And when you add both of these two things together, everything becomes just exponentially more expensive.
Right. I think we've lost Tyler here. Oh no, he's there. I thought it was frozen. He was just concentrating. Yeah, I mean, I like what you said about strategy and that kind of stuff. But I do usually, when people tell me this and say, okay, I can't believe it'd be worth that because the material cost can't be anywhere near that. My response is usually just to say, okay, well then build it yourself and see how far you get. And then if you can produce it at a lower price, then great, right? We all win. But the reality is that
there's another issue that I actually did discuss with a few other people with regards to why Chi-Fi is so cheap. And one of the reasons why is because they unfortunately skimp on the QC process.
Yeah.
And when you skimp on the QC process, you bin less drivers. You don't have to worry too much about having to match everything to the same variations and everything. And because of that, you have a lot of problems. Like, for example, with the blonde BL3s, very popular. Unfortunately, the unit variation is through the roof because they price it at $40. The costs have to go away. They have to be diverted away from something. And in this case, it would be QC. They just, that's just how they save costs. So when you buy a more expensive product, that's one thing you get, which is that you are almost guaranteed, or at least assured to a certain extent, that you're going to get the product that was advertised, or at least the product that was raved about or talked about by other reviewers, without fear that's going to be any different. So let's say a $2,000 IEM, and someone says that it's really, really good, you want to buy it, and if it's from a reputable company and if they know what they're doing, most of the cost is going to go into QC, and therefore you're going to get mostly the same product. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions, like you would still definitely get expensive products with poor QC. I'm just saying that as a general trend, you're going to get better QC, and therefore you don't have to worry too much about getting a unicorn unit versus a shoddy, slightly left of the target unit.
So something that is representative of what the marketing suggests.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in the audio industry, I don't think people look to the manufacturer's marketing to get an idea of what IEM or headphone sounds. Usually they read reviews, and it is much more you feel much more secure if the review that you're reading and the product that you buy is going to be the same.
Exactly. Yeah.
As opposed to, playing the unit variation lottery.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is definitely a challenge as well when it comes to all the measurement stuff that we talked about before. Guys, we probably have to cut it there. I do have so many more questions for both of you guys, so maybe we can do this again at some point. But it's been a real pleasure to have you guys on. This is one of my absolute favorite conversations we've had. So big thank you to both Crin and Tom from Dunu. And thanks to Tyler for sticking around and helping out as well, of course. But for everybody else in the chat, thanks for hanging out and coming to say hi and posting your questions. We'll look forward to the next live stream here next week. And any final thoughts from you guys, Tom and Crin? Nope. Okay, hearing none.
Just thanks for having me. I probably said it like, I'm very wordy, so yeah, I apologize for that.
No, by all means. This is great. This is what we want. All right, guys. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you guys in the next one.